Have you ever heard of a sweet elderly woman who ran a boarding house but was secretly a serial killer? This is the story of Dorothea Puente, an unassuming grandmother who opened her home to the elderly, disabled, and struggling. But instead of helping them, she drugged, robbed, and murdered them. For years, she fooled social workers, parole officers, and even the police, all while burying her victims in her backyard and cashing their social security checks. She was so cunning that even those closest to her never suspected that the friendly old lady making them tea was one of California's most ruthless killers. Stick around as we uncover how Dorothea Puente became one of the most unsuspecting serial killers in American history. Sacramento, California, in the 1980s, was home to a growing population of elderly and disabled individuals living on government assistance. Many of them had nowhere to go. Society had forgotten them, and they relied on the generosity of strangers to survive. That's where Dorothea Puente stepped in, presenting herself as a kind-hearted landlady running a boarding house for those in need. At 1426 F Street, she promised food, shelter, and companionship to people who had no one else to turn to. She was well respected in her community, even donating money to charities and forming relationships with local politicians and law enforcement officers. She wasn't just a landlord. She crafted an image of herself as a generous, nurturing grandmother who wanted to help society's most vulnerable. But behind her kind demeanor was a calculating, cold-blooded killer. Instead of taking care of her tenants, Puente slowly drugged them to death, using prescription sedatives mixed into their food and drinks. Once they were unconscious, she smothered them, making sure they never woke up. She was a master of deception, so skilled at covering up her crimes that even parole officers regularly visiting her home never realized what was happening. For years, Puente's boarding house was a revolving door of victims. Whenever someone died, she would simply tell their social worker or friends that they had moved away. With most of her tenants having no close family members, there was no one to question why they had suddenly disappeared. In the meantime, Puente would steal their social security checks, forge their signatures, and continue cashing in on their deaths. Her crimes might have continued indefinitely if it weren't for one suspicious disappearance that finally led authorities to her doorstep. In November 1988, social worker Judy Moyes became concerned when one of her clients, Alvaro Bert Montoya, vanished without a trace. Bert was mentally disabled, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and had been living at Puente's boarding house for months. Judy had spoken to Puente multiple times, and the landlady had always been charming and reassuring. She claimed that Bert was safe and happy, and that he had even gone to visit family. A blatant lie, as Bert had no family at all. Something felt off. Judy pressed Puente for more details, and her vague, inconsistent answers raised even more red flags. Determined to find out what happened, Judy reported Bert as missing, leading police straight to Puente's home. When officers arrived at 1426 F Street, they were met with a warm, friendly grandmother who greeted them at the door with tea and cookies. She played the role perfectly, feigning shock and concern over Bert's disappearance. But as officers spoke with the other tenants, they noticed something strange. Several of them appeared heavily sedated, their speech slurred, their movements slow. That's when one officer noticed freshly disturbed soil in the backyard. If this case is as shocking to you as it sounds, take a second to like this video. It really helps the channel out. Police decided to dig up the yard, expecting to find maybe one body. Instead, they uncovered bones, lots of them. One by one, they unearthed 7 bodies, all in various stages of decomposition. It was clear. This wasn't just a boarding house. It was a graveyard. Even as the evidence stacked against her, Puente continued playing the part of the innocent old woman. She insisted that her tenants had died of natural causes and claimed she had simply buried them to avoid the hassle of reporting the deaths to authorities. Amazingly, she was so convincing that when she asked officers if she could step out for a cup of coffee, they let her go. Puente immediately fled town, boarding a bus to Los Angeles. There, she checked into a motel under a fake name and attempted to blend in, but her face was all over the news. Just days later, a man recognized her at a bar, called the police, and her run was over. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of fraud, manipulation, and murder that stretched back decades. Puente wasn't just a landlord who snapped. She had been conning people her entire life. Before running a boarding house, she had been arrested multiple times for theft, forgery, and fraud, even spending time in prison for running a brothel. She had a long history of manipulating men, often marrying wealthy older men who later died under suspicious circumstances. Each time she managed to escape serious punishment because she knew how to play the system. Forensic experts determined that her victims had been poisoned with massive doses of prescription tranquilizers, often mixed into their tea, pudding, or soup. Once they were too weak to fight back, she smothered them, either with pillows or her bare hands. She would then cash their government checks, forging their signatures to make it look as if they were still alive. Her confirmed body count was 9 victims, but investigators believe she may have killed more than 25 people. Many of her former tenants had vanished without a trace, and with no family to report them missing. They were the perfect targets. Puente's trial was a media circus. The prosecution described her as a cold, calculating murderer who preyed on the weak. The defense painted her as a helpless old lady, insisting that she was being framed and that her tenants had simply died of natural causes. In 1993, she was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 life sentences without parole. Even in prison, Puente continued denying any wrongdoing, insisting she was a victim of circumstance. She died in 2011, never admitting to her crimes. What made Dorothea Puente so terrifying was that she didn't look like a serial killer. Unlike other murderers, she wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. She was a respected member of her community, a friendly old lady who invited people into her home with a smile. She had dinner parties, won awards, and even fooled experienced parole officers. But underneath the grandmotherly exterior, she was one of the most cold-blooded killers in American history. What do you think? Was Dorothea Puente a criminal mastermind or just a greedy fraud who took things too far? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this deep dive compelling, subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories.